2021. It's a great pleasure for me today to welcome Dr. Bruce Goldberger, a prior colleague of mine at the University of Florida and a recognized national leader and director in the field of forensic toxicology. He is professor in chief of the Forensic Medicine Division in the Department of Pathology, Immunology, and Laboratory Medicine in the College of Medicine at the University of Florida. He is director of the UF Health Pathology Laboratories, Forensics Toxicology Laboratories. He is the director of the William R. Maples Center for Forensic Medicine here at UF. He is also the program director of the Florida Emergency Mortuary Operations Response System. Dr. Goldberger also serves as a consultant for the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention, the National Center for Injury Prevention and Control, and the National Center for Health Statistics. In addition, he is also a member of the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy Emerging Threats Committee. Dr. Goldberger's presentation today is Emerging Drug Threats, Cannabinoids, Cathinoids, and Opioids. Dr. Goldberger, welcome.
Thank you, Ed. It's great to see everyone. And I do recognize a few of your faces. So I do apologize for a typo on my first slide. Cannabinoids is spelled incorrectly, but let's get moving. Today we're going to talk about the new epidemic of drug overdoses. You certainly have heard about it in the news over the last few years, and you've heard the term fentanyl associated with that. But it's more deep than that, and I'll cover that today with you. This subject matter has gotten a fair amount of press, particularly in the New York Times, where several of their analysts and journalists have been studying the drug epidemic and the evolution of it for several years. In 2018, this upshot report was published in the New York Times, Bleak New Estimates in Drug Epidemic, a record 72,000 overdose deaths in 2017. And of course, fentanyl is the big culprit. And we'll talk a fair amount about fentanyl. I know many of you are physicians on the call, and you're familiar with fentanyl as a prescription drug, both as medication to relieve pain, but also as a sedative hypnotic and anesthetic agent. But it is a drug that has replaced, not entirely, but in great part, heroin. So here in 2018, it's reported in 2017 that there were 72,000 overdose deaths. I believe, and so do my peers believe, that this is an underestimate of the number of drug overdose deaths across the US. Here in Florida, we're blessed with a statewide medical examiner system, but if we go north, just roughly 100 miles to Georgia, it's a coroner system. So in the big cities like Atlanta, Savannah, and a few others, there are medical examiner offices, but the rest of the deaths are investigated by coroners, and a coroner, as you know, is an elected official. It could be a deputy sheriff or the sheriff for the county. It could be a funeral director. And in cases like that, often drug overdoses are missed. So I can't give you an exact figure for the number of deaths, but it's well above 72,000. A lot of times we often compare 72,000 to number of lives lost in the Vietnam War, about 50,000. So this is a big figure. I guess now we compare numbers to COVID deaths. And then in 2019, this group of journalists and analysts at the New York Times again published the upshot, drug overdose deaths drop in US for first time since 1990. So this was a blessing, actually. You know, we were thinking that this epidemic that seemed to be out of control was beginning to somehow be mitigated by law enforcement and by others, basically stopping drugs from entering or coming through our borders. And that was good news. But Unfortunately, drug overdose deaths have increased pretty significantly since 2018. And I'll show you those figures. And I'll give you some reasons as well why that is as I speak with you today. It's interesting if we look back at an article that was published in Science, a leading journal, back in 2018, a group of scientists did an epidemiologic review of drug mortality rates per 100,000 people beginning in 1980 and through 2016. And you can see that this is an exponential increase in mortality. There's a quote that says, "Indeed, it is possible that in the future, the drug overdose epidemic may be driven by a new or heretofore obscure psychoactive substance." And that is what actually has happened. So these people, this research group, who I'm not familiar with, unfortunately did make this proposition that that there would be obscure psychoactive substances appearing in our communities. I always like to look back a little bit in terms of history. I'm not really a historian, but I do look back at the Physician's Desk Reference, and I know many of you, probably all of you, are familiar with the PDR. On the screen here, this is an image of what I believe is the last ever published copy book version of the PDR. The PDR now is only in digital form because the PDR is huge. Back in 1947, the first edition of the PDR was only 380 pages, and it grew to be thousands of pages. It's really thin paper, as you may recall, and it's big and heavy. But now it's a digital reference. When we look back and now we look forward, we see that there has been a great evolution in therapeutics. But coincidental to that, more recently, there's been a great evolution in emerging drugs, either novel or new psychoactive substances, which I'll talk to you today about. Before we get into some specifics this morning, this is a slide prepared by my colleagues at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, which show several waves of drug overdose deaths. These are basically opioid-related deaths. And in 1999, we begin with wave 1, which is a rise in prescription opioid overdose deaths. This is mainly associated with OxyContin. A lot of news in the press recently about OxyContin and the owners of Purdue Pharma. I forgot the family that had owned the pharmaceutical company. It was privately held. But this rise was clearly related to the pushing upon our communities this new drug to relieve pain. But it was very addictive, and individuals often transitioned to other drugs or maybe to more drug, and they died. At about 2010, we noticed or we observed this rise in heroin overdose deaths. Some people believe that as our communities and our justice systems tamp down on the availability of OxyContin and other prescription opioids, there was a coincidental change in the availability of heroin because these people were transitioning from legal drug to illegal drug. So this was driving the heroin market, but heroin became widely available and also very cheap and very pure. And then beginning in about 2013 or 2014, we begin to see the rise in synthetic opioid overdose deaths. And to me, it seems unbelievable that we've been in this for over 6 or 7 years now, because our caseloads have become larger, also more complex. But you can see the black line where we see a rise in synthetic opioid overdose deaths, principally illicitly manufactured fentanyl. We have a fourth wave at this point, and I've been working with my colleagues and modifying this figure to show a fourth rise, which would be the use of opioids along with stimulants like methamphetamine and cocaine. I'll show you some data later. For the physicians here, you're probably familiar with the majority or all of these drugs on my screen today. Even for the lay people here, you're probably familiar with most of these drugs. Buprenorphine and codeine, fentanyl, oxycodone, oxymorphone. These are all prescription opioids. These are prescription benzodiazepines like alprazolam, clonazepam or Klonopin, Valium, which is diazepam, and then stimulants like amphetamines and cocaine. And there are legal forms of amphetamines. And then there's actually a legal form of cocaine that's also used typically in the emergency department with severe nosebleeds. But this is the typical repertoire of drugs, prescription drugs we would see in overdoses. But things have really changed over the years. And what we have now is a growth in illicit drugs and also new or novel psychoactive substances. We refer to them as NPS. So the typical illicit drugs include cannabis, cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, and phencyclidine or PCP. There is no PCP here in Florida, but if you go into a big city like Washington, DC, or Baltimore, or LA, or San Francisco, you'll see phencyclidine. But we have plenty of cannabis, cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamine in Florida. And this new class of drugs, psychoactive substances, are basically a wide variety of drugs with a wide variety of effect. And I'm going to go through some of these more specifically as I speak with you this morning. This class of drug, and when we refer to class of drugs, we often refer to like opioids or benzodiazepines or amphetamines because of their effect on the human body. In the case of novel psychoactive substances, we have stimulants and depressants and hallucinogens and others in this really large class of drugs. It's not good terminology, but it is what is sticking right now in my field as a class. Part of this is because it's been driven by the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. The United Nations has created this group, UNODC, Early Warning Advisory, which was launched in 2013. And this group, worldwide group, is responsible for basically surveillance of the emergence of new psychoactive substances at the global level, worldwide, not the US only, not the EU only, but worldwide. And this group aims to monitor, analyze, and report these trends, which they do, and they have a great website with many reports, very, very proactive website. And the hope is to develop evidence-based policy responses to the emergence of these drugs. I can't say really there's been any effective policy responses really at a worldwide level. There have been responses, legal responses, scheduling responses in different jurisdictions. For example, in China, as the fentanyl analog problem was evolving, China did make the analogs illegal. We did see a rapid or precipitous drop in fentanyl analogs that were entering the US. We'll talk some about that later. So this is the list of the new psychoactive substances. Some of the more common ones, or the names some of you may recognize, would be like the phenethylamines, which are CNS stimulants. The piperazines are CNS stimulants as well. We do have some plant-based substances. The one that's most common and probably known to many of you, it's called kratom with a K, and the chemical name is mitragynine. This is a substance you could buy at a natural food store. You can buy this at a head shop, maybe even at a quick stop or some gasoline station. it has, or it is alleged to be effective for a wide range of medical conditions. So some people think it should be a legitimate therapeutic to treat drug addiction, to treat depression, to treat pain, to treat anxiety. There are many proposed uses for this drug, mitragynine. And here at the University of Florida in the College of Pharmacy, they have a grant from the National Institutes on Drug Abuse to study mitragynine, its therapeutic effects, its toxicity, as well as the means to synthesize this in a pure form so it can be given to humans in clinical trial. So it's a multi-million-dollar grant from NIDA to pharmacy. We have synthetic cannabinoids, which are simply cannabinoid-like. We'll talk about them more shortly. Synthetic cathinones are central nervous system stimulants, and the tryptamines are hallucinogenic. The UNODC, this early warning system under the UN, reports, say, prevalence of these drugs across the world. And here's a proportion of NPS by psychoactive effect. These are data published in 2019 up to December 2018. This is the most recent graphic that I can get that can really show you the comparison of these groups of drugs. So stimulants 36%, cannabinoids 30%, hallucinogens 15%. To me, it's interesting, opioids is only 7%, but it's the opioids that kill many tens of thousands of people. And then there's other drugs here as well. So here's some examples of synthetic opioids. For the physicians here on the line, we're very familiar with fentanyl, but the chemists out there have become very good at synthesizing fentanyl analogs. The recipes are available online, in Reddit, and other places. And here's the sampling, kind of a random sampling of some of the fentanyl analogs. The one that's really so very potent is a drug called carfentanil. I don't know if we have any veterinarians on the call today, but carfentanil is a drug for veterinary use only. It is reported to be hundreds of times more potent than fentanyl. And the first ever case, the sentinel case of carfentanil use in a human and death was actually here in Florida, and I'll show you a little bit of data associated with that. And I have a publication with the CDC MMWR that details our findings with regards to carfentanil. This analyte here called 4-AMPP, we now use as a marker of illicit fentanyl manufacture. So most of the fentanyl that we find in dead people now is illicitly manufactured, and this is a marker of that. So you find it in the dead person. There's other synthetic opioids. We call these the U series. They come and go. We haven't seen many deaths associated with them, fortunately. So let's talk a little bit about the synthetic cannabinoids. These are most commonly known as K2 or spice, or some people may say synthetic marijuana or MJ. These are absolutely not cannabis. This is not the cannabis that's on the street. This is not the cannabis that you can buy from the dispensaries here in Gainesville or elsewhere. Basically, this is a synthetic compound that has been manufactured or made, typically in China. It's sprayed onto a leafy material oftentimes, but not always. But it has the ability to work with the cannabinoid receptors in the brain. And I realize some of you on the line have no idea what a cannabinoid receptor is, but there are receptors within our brain that interact with drugs, and as a consequence of that interaction, you get an effect. like analgesia when you ingest an opioid. In the brain, we have a cannabinoid receptor 1, a CB1, and a CB2. So these synthetic cannabinoid compounds have great affinity to these receptors in the brain. And depending upon the affinity for either CB1 or CB2, there could be pretty severe adverse effects. A couple years ago here in Gainesville, we assisted with the investigation of well over 50 deaths in Department of Corrections here in the state of Florida. So up in the Panhandle, where there's this whole spread of prisons, many of these prisons are contracted with the state of Florida. So what was happening there is the synthetic cannabinoid was getting into the prison, either on paper or on contraband, and the prisoners would smoke it, ingest it, and many of them would simply just drop dead, and they would drop dead in the prison or drop dead in the yard, or maybe just die in their sleep. Many of these instances were videoed, so there's videotape of some of this. You'd actually see prisoners stepping over the dead prisoners. What we have concluded is that these compounds can be very toxic, very lethal. We continue to see deaths associated with synthetic cannabinoids, no longer in the prison population because the administration of the prison systems have done a really good job in preventing the drugs to enter the prison. But we see this out in our community. And we've had a number of synthetic cannabinoid deaths here in Gainesville, as a matter of fact. Our findings have been published with regards to those prisoners. Let's see, it comes in a variety of forms. It's primarily liquid or herbal, so it's on herb, but it can also come as a powder. It is a drug that has documented morbidity and mortality. You often see pockets of small mini epidemics around the country when it reaches a community. Like, let's say here in Gainesville, actually, we had a community of homeless that began to smoke a very potent form of synthetic cannabinoid. And we had 30 admissions to the Shands ED in a span of about 24 hours. Many of those patients ended up in the ICU, and several were never the same, never recovered. The next class of drugs are cathinones. These are known as bath salts. They appeared in our communities about 10 or 15 years ago. It's not methamphetamine, it's not amphetamine. Of course, it's illicit, so it's not controlled. It causes euphoria and has some psychoactive effect. It is, as I said, a stimulant. It's most often found as a tablet or in a powder. And in many of the decedents, we find its use associated with violent causes of death. For example, here in Gainesville, we've had a series of homicides in the last year or two where the decedent is shot or killed, shot and killed. And when we do their toxicology, we find this acathinone in their blood, and we can associate their behavior prior to the homicide to the ingestion of this drug. The most common drug found today is called Utilone, but there are others. There's Pentalone, Methylone, Ethylone. Again, I have several publications associated with these cathinones involving ethylone and Utilone. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit now and just talk more about the substance use problem. And also in a bit, I'm also going to talk to you about some of the work that we're doing here at the university. But the majority, but not all, but nearly all of the cases that we investigate here in the toxicology lab in Gainesville are polysubstance use cases. As I said, almost every case we find, we might find fentanyl with cocaine, or we'll find methamphetamine with oxycodone. It's unusual to find a single drug in a decedent. In the older days, a few decades ago, would be like alcohol plus an antidepressant or alcohol plus benzodiazepine. But now we might have alcohol, but we also have all these other drugs too. Obviously, the number of drugs that are ingested is directly related to the prevalence of the fatal drug overdose. So we have data, and we've shown this before, that as the number of drugs increase, so does the likelihood for an overdose. And the most polysubstance use combination today includes an opioid like fentanyl with a stimulant like cocaine. And so these are common opioid drug-drug combinations. We have opioids with alcohol, opioids with benzos. You know, that was always the common lethal mix. There's guidance now from the Centers for Disease Control regarding physicians prescribing opioids with benzodiazepines. It's highly discouraged. And here at UF, I believe they have measures in our online medical record system, EPIC, to almost prevent a physician from prescribing an opioid with a benzodiazepine. But in terms of illicit drugs, we have fentanyl with cocaine, fentanyl with methamphetamine, or fentanyl with methamphetamine and cocaine. So I actually had a conversation with someone yesterday, and it's a really frequent question that I receive is, okay, what if you mix fentanyl, which is a depressant, with a stimulant like methamphetamine? Don't they cross each other out? And they don't. And the reason for that is the stimulant is working in one area of the brain, and the depressant is working in another area of the brain. And there's no mechanism there to negate the effect. So it becomes very dangerous because in terms of morbidity and mortality, because you might have competing drug effects, but they're coincidental to one another as well, and these people will die. It's unlike the administration of Narcan, which is naloxone, to someone who's overdosing from fentanyl or from heroin, which works quite well because that's at the same site of action in the brain. We do have combined drug effects. So if you have two depressants, it's at least additive, right? So 1 + 1 is 2, but it could be synergistic. 1 + 1 is 4 or 5, meaning greater drug effect. In the evaluation of the toxicology, we often have to look at whether this is evidence of an acute drug overdose or whether the individual has developed tolerance due to the chronic use of a drug. And I'd have to say that most of the decedents that we evaluate here in Gainesville, there's evidence of chronic use. And usually that's through the pathology that's evaluated at the autopsy. And here's my one pathology slide. I am in the Department of Pathology, so I have to do a little bit of pathology, right, Ed? So there is very typical pathology associated with these drug overdoses. So when the medical examiner here in Gainesville, Dr. Hamilton, I think some of you know Dr. Hamilton, Bill Hamilton, these are the common findings. There's pulmonary edema and hyperemia. So there's purge coming from the lungs in the mouth and out the nose. And it's often bloody tinged fluid. There's bronchopneumonia, particularly in people who are down in a drug-induced coma for a period of hours or maybe a half a day before they pass. There's cerebral edema, which is swollen brain. We see often congestion in the liver and other organs, and retention of urine, and there can be retention of feces as well, particularly in cases of opioid abuse because of the constipation that follows with the overuse of opioids. There's other pathology associated with the chronic use of illicit drugs, which includes cardiomyopathy, which is a large heart, and a coronary artery disease. So in the end, it's not unusual for the laboratory here that I direct to identify maybe 10 or 12 drugs, believe it or not. And some of these would be legal drugs and others would be illicit drugs. So how does Dr. Hamilton, for example, make the final determination of death? So it's going to be the evaluation of the potency of the drug and also consideration of drug-drug effects. So, for example, an opioid plus a benzodiazepine or the opioid plus a stimulant. Those are always considered. Further, the medical examiner will evaluate the significance of the autopsy findings because oftentimes these individuals, because of their underlying disease, because of chronic drug use, that can be really pretty significant, as well as the toxicological findings. So it can be a mix. So it could be first line on the death certificate might say acute drug intoxication due to ingestion of fentanyl and methamphetamine. And on the second line of the death certificate where contributors would be included, maybe it'll say cardiovascular disease or some other autopsy finding. And there we go. The interaction of natural disease is always considered. And then consideration of MDI findings. MDI means medical legal death investigation findings. So that might include finding a needle in one's arm and the needle contains fentanyl. Or it could be someone who commits suicide by hanging, but we find stimulant drugs on board along with fentanyl. So all of those medical legal death investigation findings plus the natural disease and plus the autopsy plus the drugs all are wrapped together into the final determination of the cause of death and the manner of death as well. So for a bit of time, I'm going to talk to you about a system here at UF that we have built to surveil drug-related outcomes here in Florida. And this system's actually being built out to do the same, but for the nation. So we have a system that's called FROST, Florida Drug-Related Outcomes Surveillance and Tracking System. You can find it really easy by Googling FROST and UF. Funding was provided to us by U.S. Department of Justice and also the Office of National Drug Control Policy, which is within the executive office of the president in the White House. We use many data sources. You're not going to be familiar with these on the left, I don't think, but we rely on data from ACA here in Florida. We rely on Florida Vital Stats. We rely on the CDC. We rely on the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. We also work closely with the Florida PDMP. I've had contracts with the state PDMP since about 2012. We provide the research arm for the state PDMP, and we also we actually write the annual report for the Surgeon General on an annual basis that goes to the state legislature as well as to the governor. So lots of data, and more data is becoming available as we become more electronic here in the world. This is a screenshot from our system. We've run our system in Tableau, which is a very nice visualization system, so we can visualize all of these data. This is a slide I'll stay on for about 2 minutes so you can watch this. As I mentioned earlier this morning, the state of Florida, and actually my lab, investigated the Sentinel, the first known death due to the ingestion of carfentanil, which is the most potent fentanyl that we know of, hundreds of times more potent than fentanyl. The first case happened in Bradenton, Florida, and Manatee County. And this this figure shows each and every one of these deaths beginning, I think it's in June of 2016, all the way through to the end of 2016. So each one of these dots that you see appear on the figure, these are decedents. It's all geo-tracked. So the first death was here, and then it begins to spread. And by September, October, it spreads east into the state, over into Broward County, into Palm Beach County, into Miami-Dade County. And in the end, hundreds of people lost their lives due to the ingestion of carfentanil. We really don't know why the first death was here in Manatee County, other than it's likely that an individual here in Manatee County purchased carfentanil, either intentionally or unintentionally, from a distributor in China. It landed here, and it began to spread. These are, there's actually a lot of data contained within this slide. On the top, we show drug-caused deaths, and on the bottom, we show opioid-caused deaths going back to 2010. So in 2010, most of the drug-caused deaths were due to opioids. You can see this dark blue is an opioid-caused death, 85%. And then the opioid-caused deaths decreased, right? Not greatly, but decreased. But it's back on the, it's increasing now. Remember the New York Times article that talked about a decrease in opioid-related deaths in 2018. We actually noted that here in Florida, but in 2019, we were back at the 2017 level. But here's a measure of drug-caused deaths, right? 5,000 deaths in 2019. Down here, we have opioid-caused death. So in 2010, the fentanyl-caused deaths were only 4% of the opioid-caused deaths. So this is all prescription fentanyl, all of this here. Most of this is just going to be incidental findings in people who die at home who are, and their deaths are investigated by the medical examiner's office, and they happen to have fentanyl patches or are in hospice and given fentanyl. But then we began to see the entrance of illicitly manufactured into our communities in 2013 and 14. So take a look at this. In 2019, 75% of the opioid-caused deaths here in Florida are due to illicitly manufactured fentanyl. It's just rising. And in 2020, I don't have that data yet. I know it's increased even further. These data are from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement Medical Examiner Commission. This goes from 2010 to 2019 in each one of these blocks. And this shows the top 9 drugs most frequently involved in drug-caused deaths in 2019. So what can we see here? Here's fentanyl, right? Rising exponentially. Here's oxycodone. We've actually seen the number of oxycodone deaths decline here in the state of Florida. Here's fentanyl analogs. I'll talk just a bit. I have another slide to show you. I'm sorry, these are fentanyl analogs. This is fentanyl analogs. This is methamphetamine. Methamphetamine is increasing pretty rapidly here in the state and also nationally. This is cocaine. These are the types of visualizations we do on our website, and these are all available for download. But these are drugs that are most frequently involved in drug-caused deaths ranking from 2010 to 2019. No surprise, in 2010, 50% of the drug-caused deaths were associated with the ingestion of oxycodone. You could track it down. And in 2019, it's less than 10%. That's a really excellent mitigation that we, or the health professionals and others, have done to reduce the number of deaths due to oxycodone ingestion. So it's no longer there. Now, take a look at fentanyl. In 2014, it's 15% of the deaths. It's ranked number 6. It rises to 60% of the deaths, ranking number 1 in 2019. Then we can move down. We could see fentanyl, cocaine, morphine, fentanyl analogs, methamphetamine, heroin. Small number of heroin deaths, really, in consideration of fentanyl deaths. These are data from CDC Wonder, which is a rapid release data system that the National Center for Health Statistics employs. And the state of Florida is in blue, and the US, compared to the US, in gray. So you can take a look at, from the same time period, roughly, these are synthetic opioids, excluding methadone, just increasing exponentially. This includes fentanyl. These are natural and semi-synthetic opioids. That would be like oxycodone and hydrocodone, hydromorphone. There's heroin. Florida is below the figures for the nation when it comes to heroin. There's some concern about methadone these days because during the lockdown, the methadone clinics had to essentially shut down. And there are thousands of people here in Florida that are getting methadone for the treatment of their opioid dependency. And when the shutdown was implemented about a year ago, patients were given, many more patients were given take-home methadone. That is, rather than going to the methadone clinic every day and somehow getting them exposed to COVID, they're going to take home methadone. So it's called take home. So they might get a week's worth or even a month's worth of methadone. And so the National Institute of Drug Abuse, they actually contacted us here at Florida because they know we do the surveillance, and they wanted to know, have we seen an increase in methadone related deaths associated with all of this take home methadone? And actually, so far, we haven't really seen an increase in methadone associated mortality since the lockdown. Maybe a slight increase, but nothing significant right now. So the patients who are dependent on methadone are getting their methadone and they're not abusing it, which is really a great thing. These are fentanyl analogs. Remember, some time back, I showed you a slide with analogs. So this shows from Q1 2016 all the way through to the end of 2019, the analogs. So in 2016, we had carfentanil. There's cyclopropylfentanyl, there's furanylfentanyl, there's methoxyacetylfentanyl, different analogs of fentanyl. And actually, the Sentinel first reported case of acetylfentanyl was also in Bradenton, Florida, and was reported by the lab here in Gainesville, but that was back in 2014 or so. We also have a paper on that case. And here's this propionyl of 4-AMPP, which is an indicator of illicitly manufactured fentanyl. So we begin to see a rise in this 4-AMPP, which clearly demonstrates that it's the illicitly manufactured fentanyl used by people here, used by the decedents. So just a minute or two before I run out of my time, and there'll be plenty of time, I think, for questions, is I'm really excited to well, it's a little bit old news now, but to announce that the University of Florida was selected by National Institutes on Drug Abuse to run their NDUS, their National Drug Early Warning System. It used to be run by the University of Maryland in College Park, And then we were awarded competitively a contract beginning in April 2020. So NDUS, what this does is it expands the surveillance of drug overdoses from a local, like national level, state level, to a national level. This is our website, ndus.org. Without going into really a lot of detail, we have this coordinating center, and we get input directly from the director of NIDA, as well as our consultants. We have 18 Sentinel sites located across the country, from west to east. We run a virtual network for this early warning system. We collect local, state, and national data. We'll continue to do the traditional surveillance that's under FROST, under my purview. But we're doing lots of other work as well, including monitoring drug markets online. And we're in the process now demonstrating that what you find online, maybe not folks on this call, but people who are abusing drugs, what's available online is what we see in decedents and dead people. We've shown a direct correlation of the appearance and disappearance of these emerging drugs, both on the internet as well as in decedents. I'm not going to go through this slide in great detail, but we are providing an early warning network, integrating sites across the country. We're using community level indicators. We're incorporating novel surveillance methods. This would include testing of drugs in our community. We can't do that now because of COVID-19, but in the future, we'll go to raves and other venues to check drug on site, as well as doing hair testing for drug exposure. We can't do that now because of COVID for obvious reasons. We're going to harmonize indicators from our sites and publish them online. We're going to disseminate our findings through FROST and other means, including those visualizations. We will do on-ground epidemiologic investigations, but that's on hold right now, again, because of the epidemic or the pandemic. And we work directly with, and we actually met recently with the director of NIDA, Nora Volkow, who has a Florida connection, and some of you may have met her when she's come to town a few times. She did her fellowship here. And then we also have students and other scientists who are training with us under a T32. Finally, we have, well, not quite finally, but wrapping up, we have a weekly briefing. It's a weekly newsletter that goes out through the internet. If you're interested in hearing more about drugs, you can go to ndus.org and register there. We send one email a week, and that's it, to our subscribers, and we have about 750 subscribers at this point from all areas. Of course, we have a Twitter feed, which is at NDUS News. And so what's the future as I wrap up? This is actually a slide that I copied from a presentation that I gave to experts in national security. This was pre-pandemic. I was in DC at a national security meeting, and they asked me what the future is. What does it look like? So I spoke about the new drugs, and I said, we'll continue with the old drugs as well. And that was the focus of my presentation today. We have new drug delivery systems, including vaping. So, of course, vaping initially was designed to vape nicotine, but now you can vape cannabis or THC, and you can also vape fentanyl and other drugs. They've made devices that burn very high, very hot, so you can vaporize drug. Pre-pandemic, There was a lot of news coming out from the CDC and other institutions about complications, pulmonary complications associated with vaping. I think that's all been smothered because of the pandemic. And maybe we'll return to that post-pandemic, if that's even possible. I think there needs to be a lot of work understanding the basis for polysubstance use. Like, are these folks, these people who are abusing abusing multiple drugs for a particular reason or not? And we simply don't have great insight into that at this point. And further, it would be interesting to understand better the transition from old drugs like heroin to fentanyl. I can give you theories about that. For example, fentanyl is euphoric, it's potent. It doesn't carry some of the ill effects of heroin, so it's more desirable. But it would be interesting to actually conduct some studies or surveil this issue. Some of my colleagues refer to this as psychochemical warfare, simply because these are psychochemicals, these are psychoactive substances, and it's killing tens of thousands of people, right? And it has gotten much worse during the pandemic. We have some supplemental funding from NIDA to actually look at the burden on the funeral directors, the burden on EMS, and the burden on medical examiners and coroners. And there is clearly going to be, or we're going to find, and this is based on preliminary data, that there is a significant increase in drug-related deaths. And then finally, it was a national security conference meeting, small, but we can't forget that some of these drugs can and actually have been weaponized. Carfentanil is a drug that was weaponized by the Russians. You might remember about 10 years ago when the Moscow theater was taken under control by the Chechen rebels. And while there was some negotiation done to free the hostages, it was unsuccessful. So the Russians pumped in vaporized carfentanil into the theater. There were well over 100 dead people there. Some people did survive. But these people succumbed to the toxicity of carfentanil. And so certainly these drugs can be weaponized, which is a really scary thought. And that is the end of my talk. Sorry, I didn't end in a really positive way. But anyway, I hope it was interesting and enlightening to you all. And I'm here for questions.
Thank you.
Julianne?
Ed, I was going to ask you if you wanted to make any comments before I go to questions.
I think it's a pretty disturbing presentation, but I knew Dr. Goldberger had the newest and latest material and certainly gives us all powerful cause for thought. I think there's lots of questions, Julianne. You can go ahead.
Okay. Eli, yours was the first in the chat. Do you want to go ahead and ask it yourself, unmute yourself?
Okay, so I have 3 or 4 questions, and you can choose which one you want to answer. Can you discuss the mechanism of addiction? That's the first question. Number 2, are hallucinogenic drugs addictive? 3, can we hold those who are authorized to prescribe what Purdue sold guilty of malpractice? 4, are there synthetic neurotransmitters that cause harm? Are there not also synthetics that are beneficial?
Lots of questions. I'm going to skip the addiction question because I'm not an expert like maybe some of you on the call might be with regards to addiction. But these drugs that I described to you today are, they are addictive. So it does, the addiction leads to repeated use and also harm to the body. But I don't want to get into the specifics of addiction because I'm not really prepared to do that with you today. These hallucinogenic drugs are not as addictive as the opioids and the benzodiazepines would be. We know cannabinoids are addictive as well. One measure of addiction is it results in repeated or chronic use of the drug. So individuals that are using the opioids, the benzodiazepines, and the cannabinoids will use the drug repeatedly because it is rewarding to the brain. It's pleasurable. Regarding Purdue, they've been sanctioned by DOJ, and I forgot what their financial payout is, but it's in the many, many, many millions of dollars. So they have been found they've been found civilly to be responsible for what I illustrated on my slide today, which was the increased use of oxycodone or OxyContin, which resulted in a large number of people becoming addicted to it. And then we saw a large number of people who died as a consequence to it. And then of course we have many million, or many hundreds of thousands of people probably, you know, are still afflicted by that problem. Okay, next question.
Okay, thank you. Alice Gridley, if you'll unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Goldberger. It's an eye-opening presentation. I'm just very curious. You mentioned a couple of times that Bradenton seemed to be the epicenter of the start of the spread. And I'm just wondering if they have figured out why that is.
We have not. We do continue to see a high percentage based on numbers per 100,000 people in that community, in that county. So I unfortunately don't have an answer for you. We really don't know why that area was afflicted by these drugs.
All right, thank you. Paula, go ahead. You're unmuted.
Yep. So it appears that a large number of these illicit drugs are brought into the country rather than manufactured here. And I think I heard you mention China once or twice. Wondered if China is the big sort of importer of these drugs, and why do you think that might be?
So China was, but no longer. They were particularly associated with the synthetic cannabinoids and probably do continue with that particular drug class. But the fentanyl analogs in particular were being synthesized in China. They have very skilled chemists over there, and they have the ability to manufacture these analogs in the plants over there. The word was, and I don't know if there's any truth to it, that the pharmaceutical plants in China, they would manufacture legal drug during the day, and then at nighttime, they would manufacture the illegal drug and then ship it to the States. So these drugs are very potent. So just a minuscule amount of drug is sufficient for many uses, many doses. So they could be packaged up and shipped to us in large containers, in the mail, in small boxes. And there are literally millions of packages that come from China into the US every day. So there's really very little way to intervene. Now, things have changed a bit because in China, there was some rescheduling of these substances, meaning that they're now illegal, particularly the fentanyl analogs. And as soon as that legislation was put into place, we saw a rapid diminish of analogs here in the United States. But what has happened, interestingly, is that the Mexican cartels have now taken over the market, and they are now manufacturing fentanyl. Fentanyl is very easy to manufacture. So I would say a large portion, I can't quantify how much, is of the fentanyl is manufactured in Mexico and comes across the border into the US. The same is true with methamphetamine and cocaine. So, but primarily meth and fentanyl are coming from Mexico.
Wow, okay. So you were saying that initially these fentanyl derivatives were legally being produced in China and shipped legally to the United States.
That's right. And here in the United States for some time, these analogs were not considered illegal by the Drug Enforcement Administration. But US Congress passed legislation that made these analogs illegal. And therefore, there was less interest on behalf of the Chinese chemists to ship the drugs over here. You know, people tend to go underground when something becomes illegal. But the fentanyl comes easily over the Mexican border from the Mexican cartels.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Goldberger, are you okay with a few more questions? I have hands and chat, but we're at 11 o'clock.
Sure, I'm fine.
Okay. Rick Gold had a question about a chart. What is the chart measuring deaths?
I'm not sure which chart that is, but most of my charts were deaths. Maybe all of my charts were decedent,
Right.
were data from decedents.
Okay. And then is attention being paid to risk factors for drug addiction? Are the risk factors treatable?
That's more of a psychiatry question, and I'm not a psychiatrist and I don't have any experience in psychiatry. But certainly our psychiatrists are now aware of the synthetic drugs and the harms that they pose. So my answer is yes, but I can't give you any specifics.
Okay, Izzy, go ahead.
Yeah, can you give us some, it's related to the last question, can you give us some other examples of how this data has been used to reduce the use through either enforcement or some other means to reduce the use of particular drugs?
So one really prime example is work that a student of mine did, a young man, not so young anymore, Chris Delcher, in epidemiology, where we looked at the implementation of the state of Florida PDMP and how it mitigated in a direct way oxycodone overdoses in Florida. And we were able to quantify that effect. I think it was saving 45 lives a month. These studies, these epidemiologic studies, do provide some basis for our mitigation work in this field. Unfortunately, some of it's retrospective, but once we establish these definitive relationships, then we can work harder. So our work with the PDMP, for example, was well publicized, and I believe all 50 states now have PDMPs in place, and that's why we have seen a decrease in drug overdoses because of the state PDMPs. For those who don't know what a PDMP is, that's a prescription drug monitoring program. So when a physician, when your physician gives you a prescription, let's say for 5 milligrams of oxycodone, and you take it to the pharmacy, two things happen. One is the doctor has to enter that into the PDMP, and the PDMP will receive those data. And if there's evidence that you are doctor shopping, like getting oxy from other physicians, there'll be a red flag, there'll be a warning in the system. The same will happen at the pharmacy level. So CVS or Walgreens, wherever you get your drug, they will do a query as well in the PDMP. So this way we can assure that, that patients are getting appropriate controlled substances like oxy.
Thank you. Keith Berg, would you like to ask your question? I don't want to get it wrong from chat. Keith, can you hear me? Unmute yourself.
I see the question.
Oh, okay.
So how will NDUS, that's that new organization here at Florida, handle I think how will we handle the information? And
I
how,
can perhaps clarify. You mentioned early on that in Florida, the drug information was centralized, but in many other states, it's not. So given that, I wasn't sure how NDUS can manage US-wide information when it's so varying.
yeah, that's a really good thing that you picked up on. The Frost dashboard that we have, that I showed you a screenshot from, is considered a leading dashboard in the nation. So if you query other states, or if you go all the way to ONDCP at the White House, they will acknowledge that the Frost dashboard is the best. Some states, well, I'd say all states have dashboards now, but some states' dashboards are just simply not as comprehensive as ours. We're going to use the same processes and this same structure here at UF to build out a national dashboard. You can go to the CDC, they have a dashboard. You can go to SAMHSA, they have a dashboard. But we're going to build out a very comprehensive dashboard.
Could you explain what a dashboard is?
Yeah, I'll show you. Let me get back onto my screen. This is a dashboard. So if you go to the Frost website, this is what you will see. And then you can click on these arrows and it takes you to another page that might look like this. But basically, this is what a dashboard looks like. Some of you may visit the state of Florida COVID dashboard on a daily basis to see where the state is in regards to COVID new cases and COVID deaths. That's a dashboard. That's a technical term for a place to find data.
Thank you.
Jeannie, go ahead.
Hi, Dr. Goldberger. I wanted to say it's sort of a comment and maybe a little bit of a question. I watch a TV show called Live Rescue, and it's about EMS and fire related. You know, they always seem to send a fire truck and the EMS, and they go to different parts of the country, different cities or counties. And one of the counties they go to is Alachua County. And it seems like a large majority of the calls that they go on are drug overdoses. And of course, then they give them Narcan, then they load them in the truck and they always take them to Shands. I've never heard them taking them to North Florida hospital. So that's only, of course, a small portion because the show's only a couple of hours. But I was wondering two things. One, is Shands considered like the county hospital? Because I'm from Miami, and the county hospital, of course, is Jackson Memorial, which means taxpayers pay for them because they don't have insurance, I'm sure. And or is Shands considered our county? I don't understand that part of it. I don't know if you can answer that, but
Maybe Dr. Burns would answer better than me, but I won't put him on the spot. We used to have Alachua General Hospital, which was on the east side of Shands, and that was considered like the county hospital. Maybe 20 years ago or so, Shands acquired Alachua General Hospital. So Shands is considered the county hospital, but I don't like that term. You mentioned the show Live Rescue or whatever it's called, and I've seen it a few times. I have a stepson who's a firefighter rescue with Alachua County Fire Rescue. So we've watched it a few times. Shands does have better drug treatment facilities. So if someone is acutely ill because of a drug overdose, they will be brought to Shands here, UF Health. That's a better term, to UF Health.
Right.
And then once they are stabilized, they may be sent to inpatient treatment, which is over on 39th Street or 39th Avenue.
So that would be like counseling or so forth, maybe get them on methadone and et cetera.
Yes,
Okay. All right. Thank you.
sure.
Do you have time for one more? I see one more hand.
Yes.
Okay, Lynn Holtz, if you want to unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Goldberger. My question is, I noticed that several states have now legalized marijuana for recreational use. Have you noticed any change in the profiles of states and other kinds of overdose causing death when in those states, as opposed to the majority of states which have not done so?
Yes, so there are a few states now where, in addition to medical marijuana being legal, recreational marijuana is legal as well. Colorado, the state of Washington, I believe in California. And in those states, particularly in Colorado, there's been a lot of study looking at the outcomes of that. For example, there has been an increase in motor vehicle crashes associated with impairment due to the use of marijuana. There have been other effects as well, like children eating gummies infused with THC. There have been instances of individuals eating marijuana-infused brownies, for example, and ingesting so much that the individuals have become psychotic and they've jumped from buildings. So I think it's probably inevitable that marijuana is going to be legal nationwide. There's obviously, if you read the news, there's some push with the new Biden administration that it will become legal. But I sure hope that there is a way to mitigate its use and somehow, if that's even possible, stop the abuse of the substance. Its use is an epidemic, even in those states where it's not legal. And that includes Florida. We see many traffic-related crashes, including fatalities, even here in Gainesville, that, in my belief, are due to impairment caused by marijuana use. One thing to remember is that I know I'm a bit younger than you guys, but I'm actually close to retirement myself. The marijuana that was very common in the 1960s when I was growing up, in the 1970s, it was maybe 3 or 4 or 5% THC. The THC now that you can purchase on the street corner, this is not THC from the dispensaries, but from the street corner, is often 15 and 20% THC.
Wow.
So the doses are much higher. Now, people typically, when they ingest marijuana, ingest it to a particular level of euphoria. But it's very easy to become impaired by marijuana. You could injure yourself, or God forbid, you could hurt someone as well, hurt or kill them. So we need to be very, I guess, thoughtful about how this is implemented if we get there. But I actually think we will get there now. There is a strong movement with our politicians to legalize it nationally.
Thank you. Ed?
Well, thank you, Dr. Goldberger. Exceptionally revealing and somewhat disturbing presentation, but we sincerely appreciate it. And we admire you for all the contributions you've made to this field, and wish you every luck and every good luck in the future on this. And best wishes always.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you for your leadership as well. Ed was my supervisor many, many years ago, so I appreciate his service and his trust in me as a toxicologist. I guess I have to end by saying I'm sorry I had to present data on a disturbing and depressing subject, but I think it's better to know and be educated than not at all. So I'm always available if you guys have questions. My email is right online, and it's great to see a few of you because I recognize your faces and your names. Thank you, guys.
Hey, thanks.
Bye-bye. Be well.